Well, pull up a chair and set a spell here at Tales from SYL Ranch Live, the vlogcast that reminds you to always know where your towel is. And I'm your host, Bill Stone. And tonight on Tales from SYL Ranch, we have the Fandi Masters' 60th anniversary review of Quatermass and the Pit. And I'm also going to have some commentary about Facebook and a lot about Patreon. Hey, Larry, glad to see you here tonight. However, why is that? Oh, man, Google thinks I just talked to it. I hate that. Anyway, to explain my show for new viewers or people who might be watching in the archives or people who might not come in at the top of the hour or right at Larry does with his towel, I do live reviews. Sometimes I do serious films and TV. Sometimes I do schlock. And sometimes I do serious and modern stuff with a broad appeal, like I'll be starting to do the Orville when it comes around next month. Usually, however, I stick to a period from about 1900 to 1980, and that's because the period after 1980 is pretty well documented. We had a lot of new science fiction and a lot of really great technology that allowed us to document it. But the period from 1980 to 1900 is not very well documented, and so part of the reason I do the show is to document it. It is live, so I will take any and all questions, comments, and nasty remarks. I'll respond to as many of my viewers as possible. You can tell me if I missed something, if I'm full of crap, or if I just happen to be amazingly hoopy-frooed, which is probably more likely. I also go into much more depth than most reviewers. I don't just talk about moments in the film that I liked or things like that. I go into acting, direction, cinematography, and some of the mechanics of making a film. And I can do this to some extent because a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, I was once an actor. And so I can speak with some authority. Not as much authority as a modern working actor, and I never want to give that impression, but with some authority. As they often say, those who can, do, and those who can't, teach. And that's probably what my reviews kind of are like. Larry there says live in living color. Yes, we're getting into the 50s era and late 50s where we started to see things that were in living color, although Quatermass and the Pit was not in color. That was black and white. As a non-spoiler review for the show, I can say, let me move this window around so it makes a little more sense. I can say, while this seems to be an occasionally common story because it has been used over and over since then, it was extremely unique at the time in the late 1950s and 1958. It was a unique story. Not unique necessarily in terms of literary science fiction. This idea had been used before. But it was a new idea for television, that's for certain. And I think the story does stand the test of time. The movie version got my attention. Oh, yeah. Yeah, the movie version I saw, the whole reason, the entire reason that I did this whole thing with all of these Quatermass ones was because as a small child, and I don't remember how old, I watched one of those on one of those late night movie programs, and they had this running, the Hammer adaptation of this. Oh my God, it just scared the crap out of me. It's something that still sticks to me to this day. I can remember the scene of, this alien hive thing like you see in this, but in color. And it really freaked me out. And I remember it still to this day. So, yeah, it definitely got my attention. That's why I'm doing this whole thing with Quatermass. But I do think that this story is one that stands the test of time. In a film this old, 60 years old, you have to ask yourself, what if you took this script and you remade it today, but all you did was you changed the technology to be more current and you changed the locale so that it was in current 2018 rather than clearly being in 1958. And if you changed those things, but otherwise did not change the script at all, would it still work? And the answer in this one is yes, it would definitely work. In fact, the story itself has been copied repeatedly, often by Doctor Who, and I will get into that very specifically when I talk about Doctor Who and the show's influence on it. It does have a fairly large scale in terms of what they wanted to do, although, the practical reality was they couldn't shoot some of that large scale. You could do that today. You could certainly do that today and make some of the stuff that happens off screen on screen. It can still be frightening. I really think so with the sound effects that they use here for some of this stuff, and also how people are taken over by the aliens and some of the alien stuff that goes on. So That's a non-spoiler. I can definitely recommend this. I would definitely say go watch this sometime. It is on the Internet Archive if you want to find it. It's not very easy. You have to go to the Internet Archive, search for Quatermass in the Pit, and then the episodes don't come up in order, and you have to kind of click around. But they are all out there. I watched them on my smartphone, among other things. So, okay, bit of an introduction here. It is my firm belief that you cannot either watch nor review a film this age without having some kind of historical perspective on it. And, I try to always think about how would I be if I was approaching this film for the first time as a viewer or a reviewer in 1958. And a lot has changed since 1958. It's been 60 years, and if you don't know some of the historical context, it's really hard to judge it properly. And there are things that always date. Special effects always date. You have to give special effects technology of the time. And always remember to yourself, whatever we think is really cool in terms of special effects today, come back to me in 60 years when I guess I'll be reviewing things that happened in this era. Come back to me in 60 years, and everything that we think is cool in terms of special effects will completely date. And your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren will be laughing at it. Larry says, First Men on the Moon, 1964, had similar insect aliens. Yeah, I'm going to get around to reviewing that at some point. I have holes next year in my schedule that aren't things that are falling on anniversaries, so I may put that one in there someplace. It's not... I usually do things on anniversaries, but I still have lots of holes. In fact, you'll see next month where I've filled 2 holes with something that is definitely not on their anniversaries. Sociology also always changes. You have to forgive some of the sociology because, for example, they had different assumptions about male and female gender roles. They had different assumptions about race relations, which actually factors into this, and I didn't know it until I did the research on it. And they had, a lot of times, different ideas about government. And again, remember, anything that you think is normal sociologically today, the clothes that you wear, the assumptions that you make about society, are not going to be the same in 60 years. And when your great-grandchildren look back at you and see you in those pictures, they're going to sneer at what you wore. Just look at the 1960s. Everybody thought that that was cool, and now we look back at it and we laugh. Look at the 1970s, all that disco stuff, and we look back and we laugh. Larry says 1964 is 55 years, 55 in 2019. Well, that's a good deal. Maybe, like I say, I got some holes. Maybe I'll stick that in there. Booked up now through February, but I still have holes next year, so that's a good idea. I'll see if I can't do that one. By the way, if you're watching live and you do something like that and you suggest something, there's a very good possibility that I might actually do it if somebody wants me to do a review. Now, my problem in trying to document this context is I try to do it with every episode so that you can, as I say, approach it as a viewer of that time. But the problem is that with setting a context for every video, while it's really informative, is also very repetitive. I tend to do my reviews on anniversaries, the 10th anniversaries, generally speaking, although with Larry's suggestion, it was 55, that's not a bad idea. And I really end up saying the same things about 1958 life and fandom, and if I did that for every single time that I did in next year doing 1959 movies, it's going to get really repetitive. So, in terms of this one, 1958, I covered a lot of fandom and the era of 1958 when I reviewed Hammer's Dracula, and I took those things out intentionally as clips. So I don't want to bore my regular viewers with repeating it. So I'm just essentially asking you to do something that I might have done when I was an instructor at the place that shall not be named. And I would say, please go do the extra reading. The links for both of those clips for that era are in the description below. I certainly urge you to watch them and get a very good idea of what life was like in 1958 and what science fiction fandom was like in 1958. I will talk about some of the historic things as we go through because they do impact directly the review and the show. But, if you really want to get a great idea, watch those videos. I spend, 20 minutes, half hour on each of them. Sometimes more. When I've done my 100th anniversary ones, like I'm going to do one next month, Oh my God, those get long. The review will run 3 hours just because I have to set a lot of context for something that is 100 years old. One thing that you always have to remember on this one is the BBC and how they did their productions at that time. The BBC, until the mid to late 1960s even, most of their stuff was live. Now, most TV shows and movies certainly are not live, so what they do is they shoot the movie out of order. If you're not familiar with how this works, say you're making Star Trek, and you have 10 scenes in the script that occur on the bridge. Well, you go and you set up on the bridge, and you shoot those 10 scenes all at the same time. Then if you might have another 5 scenes that are in engineering, you go to the engineering set, you set up there, and you shoot all 5 of those scenes at the same time. And if you're going down to an alien planet, same thing. You find a location, you shoot there, all the scenes that happen there all at the same time. And then you do editing, and that's really important in modern films. You take out everything in the bits and pieces, the 5 that were shot over here, the 2 that were shot over there, the 3 that were on location, and you edit them all together, hopefully, into something that makes sense. And again, on the BBC, it's a little different. Much of their productions, until, like say, the late 1960s, were live, so they couldn't do that. They had to shoot them in order. So that meant if you had a scene on the bridge, they didn't do it this way. But if you had a scene on the bridge, you shot that scene. Then if there was immediately after that a scene on the transporter room, you moved to the transporter room and you shot that scene. And if you were beaming down to the alien planet, you went to the alien planet and you shot that scene. And you shot it live. It was damned difficult. What that really meant was that the director was sitting in a booth. And it's kind of like how they do modern sporting events live. You have a bunch of cameras, and the director's saying, watching a monitor, you go, okay, camera 1, and then camera 2, camera 1, camera 3. And it would get more difficult because it's live. It's like mounting a stage play. And so the actors, while they would have their marks, and what a mark is they put a mark on the floor, literally on the floor, usually with some kind of tape. And the actor has to make sure that they stand in that spot so that the camera gets them the way that they're supposed to. Well, in a live production, in one that's filmed, if the actor doesn't make his mark, they cut and they start over. In a live one, you can't do that. So you might have the actor slightly off their mark. So the director is sitting there going, okay, camera 1. Camera 3, you're going to have to move in a little bit and go a little bit to the left. Okay, good. Camera 2, camera 3. And they'd have to do that all the time. They would rehearse these things during the week, usually have a couple of what amounted to dress rehearsals on the day of the transmission, and then they would transmit it live that night. Now, in this case, there was some interesting stuff going on, because in this case, they actually did a fair amount of location and pre-shot sequences. They shot them in advance, more like traditional films where they could edit these things. And you can sometimes tell, it's interesting to me, there's scenes that occur like at the roadblock that the police have set up to keep everybody out from the excavation site. Sometimes you can actually see them when they breathe. You see the breath exhale. You can actually see their breath going out. That was something they shot on a location because inside of a soundstage is usually a lot warmer than that. You don't get that, exhaling. So you can sometimes see, but it's interesting. You're lucky the BBC recorded these Quatermass shows. Yeah, there are 4 episodes missing from Quatermass 2. These, however, and I'll talk about how they were preserved, but have been preserved very well. And in fact, it's not the Internet Archives version, but if you go out and you buy a copy, they have been significantly restored very recently. So the fact that they had all of these pre-shot sequences meant that they could then transmit them live as they were doing it. They would just insert them where they needed to. It's a really good thing to take a look at the first Quatermass serial, Quatermass Experiment, and compare it with this one, because they didn't really have anything shot in advance for Quatermass Experiment, and you can kind of see it. Things that should happen off camera don't, or there's a lot of action that occurs off camera that people just talk about seeing and you never see. By doing these pre-shot sequences, then they could insert those and do some of those things that would have occurred off camera. And instead of being talking about it, you see it. And some of the things that maybe occurred on the set were off the set and a little more logical. And it makes for a more coherent story. Again, take a look at Quatermass, the Quatermass Experiment. It is very, very different in that respect. As always, with any theatrical production of any kind, they're dealing with these three enemies, which were talent, time, and money. Now, the talent was pretty good here all the way around. Time was obviously limited. You had a week to rehearse, and then you did a couple of dress rehearsals on the day of, and then you put the thing out live. And the money, well, it had a larger budget than the others, and it does show, particularly in sets and the pre-shot sequences. It was definitely a larger budget than in Quatermass Experiment. We couldn't show big crowd scenes there. Here we can. Some of the sets were less than complete. Here they are. And again, a lot of the action that would have occurred off screen is on screen because of that. So the other thing to remember is even when they were shooting, if it was shooting for not live, the BBC still had rules about how many cuts you could make. Now, if you want to see this really well in action, I suggest you watch one of the films that came out on the Doctor Who 50th anniversary, which was An Adventure in Time and Space, which is a great movie, by the way. If you watch that movie and you don't get the feels, you've been conditioned by a lifetime of crappy movies to be dead inside. It is a great movie, but in addition, if you are a student of film history, if you watch that, you can see them. They actually talk about it. Those shows, even though they were recorded, were not allowed to do what we usually have done in films and TV in the United States, shoot them out of order. So they have a scene in the console room of the TARDIS, and then they have another scene outside. They would move from one to the other like that and back and forth. And the directors were not allowed to make many cuts. I think it was like 3 cuts at that point. So if your actor flubbed their lines, you hoped they could power through it. If they flubbed them badly, then you had to stop. You made a cut. You went to them and you said, okay, Bill, in terms of Bill Hartnell, who's played the Doctor at this time. Bill, you screwed that line up so bad we had to stop. You got to get it the next time. I've only got 2 more cuts. So that's how they had to do it. And it was, like I say, a lot like mounting a stage play in some respect, except you had this director sitting back up there calling the shots and attempting to make some level of direction and cinematography more or less simultaneously. So, okay. All of that context setting out of the way, I can issue myself a...
Spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. All hands, prepare for incoming spoilers.
Yes, it is a spoiler alert, and that is because I am a Fandi master, and that means that the fandom is strong with me. And that means that nothing is new, nothing is original, and at worst I figure it out about a half an hour early. This is unfortunately not a boast or a brag. This is sadly where you find yourself after having watched, read, and listened to about 100 years worth of science fiction. You just can't see all of this new stuff for the entire century that came before, and you discover there just isn't that much that's new in the world. And it does sometimes interfere with your ability to enjoy things. Not so much here. I walked into this knowing a fair amount about the plot. But again, what I try to do is pull myself back. What would this be like in 1958? How would I react to this story if I hadn't watched, read, and listened to 100 years worth of science fiction? I'm not always successful, but I still enjoyed this one, despite the fact that I knew a lot about it. 1958, flat in the background. Yeah, this is somebody's living room. I always try to find something that is concurrent with the era, but yes, this is a roughly mid-1950s, late 1950s living room. You can see over one shoulder here, they have a television set. That was a pretty cool television set at the time, and this is a 1950s sort of architecture, so yes. So, about this film, Quatermass and the Pit. Now, I do sometimes, and I will tonight, go through the plot on this one. There are workmen who are digging for some new housing development, and they discover a pre-human skull while they're working at Hobbs Lane. Now, Hobbs Lane here is Hobbs Lane. However, it was formerly called, and this becomes a story point, it was formerly called Hobbs Lane, Hob''S, and Hob was an antiquated term for the devil, and they're doing this in London. Now, Dr. Matthew Roney, who is one of the big stars here, who is a paleontologist, examines the remains and reconstructs a dwarf-like humanoid with a very large volume brain, which he believes to be a form of primitive man. In fact, he goes on all the time about how this fits into the fossil record. They don't talk about the fossil record. That was something that would become a term much later. But that's what he's saying. It fits into the fossil record. This is something that is part of human evolution. But as further excavation is undertaken, something looks like a missile is unearthed. And with further work by Roney's group is halted because the military believed that this could be an unexploded World War II bomb. What you have to understand about that period, too, is World War II, London got bombed. It's not like the United States where we sent people over, but really we didn't see anything much on our own shores. These guys got bombed. And sometimes the bombs didn't go off. And sometimes they didn't get discovered for years. So that's what's happened here. They think that they've got an unexploded bomb. Well, more or less contemporaneous with this, Professor Bernard Quatermass of the British Rocket Group, who we've seen before in the other two serials, his organization has been taken over by the military. They're planning to build military bases on the moon. By the way, they mentioned something here that is absolutely true, and it's why I hope that the United States gets to the moon first and builds a permanent base there, because the military in this show says outright that if you have military bases and if you have rockets aimed down at your targets on the Earth, there really isn't much they can do. They're going to have to kowtow to your whims, because all you have to do is drop a rocket down the gravity well. It's a hell of a lot easier to do that than it is to shoot up from the Earth's gravity. It's much easier to fire down. And there isn't much that anybody on Earth can do about it. Whoever gets there first wins. It's just that simple. Yes, Larry says London got bombed in both World War II and World War II. Yeah, they absolutely were. This one, they're thinking it's a World War II unexploded bomb. So Roney calls in Professor Quatermass, and Quatermass, now being taken over by the military, sort of uses this as an excuse to bring along a military guy and see what they've got so that they can stop disturbing what they think is an archaeological find. And so Quatermass and Colonel Breen, who is now going to be taking over the rocket group, become intrigued by this site. And as more of the artifact is uncovered, additional fossils are found, a couple of which are embedded right in this structure. And Roney dates this stuff back to about 5 million years, which rather suggests that the structure they're uncovering is 5 million years old. Yep, call in UNIT. Absolutely. If it had occurred in the Doctor Who, if it had occurred in the Whoniverse, and UNIT existed in 1958, which it didn't. UNIT didn't start existing until mid-1960s. But if they had, this would have been a job for UNIT at some point. So they get to this thing pretty well completely unearthed and discover that it is not an unexploded bomb. It is largely hollow inside, with most of everything that's been inside of it as, rotted away and corroded and been gone over the 5 million years. But what they do find is a door on the inside that is covered with a series of 5 intersecting circles, which Roney then identifies as an occult pentacle, which is etched on a wall that seems to be, just flat and must lead somewhere else, but it's an absolutely flat surface. So they figure, okay, we're going to get into this thing. We have to drill a hole so we can get, some purchase on it in order to, actually open the door. And they try this with a diamond drill. They try it with a boride carbine drill, boron nitride drill, and nothing works. It is that hard. And when they do try it, however, a hole appears on its own. A hole just appears that goes through this door. It's a small hole, but something that they could use because the door apparently unscrews. So it's something they could use to get a purchase on to unscrew it. However, when they do this, there's a bunch of vibrations and strange noises that cause people who are anywhere near it to have some very ill effects. And that's one of the things, by the way, in this movie that is, to me, still creepy. That music that they were using is, to me, still creepy. So Quatermass, in 1958, laser was invented. Yeah, I don't think that was necessarily on their radar as writers. I don't know if a laser would have worked. In any case, it just appeared by itself. So Quatermass starts interviewing a local residents and discovers that there are ghost stories and poltergeist stories that have been around in the area for decades. And then one of the workers, a hysterical soldier, he goes into this thing and he comes back out claiming that he saw a dwarf-like apparition walk through the wall of this artifact. And this description matches a 1927 newspaper account of a ghost. So after the drilling, they open up the wall, and inside, Quatermass and the others find the remains of aliens that resemble giant three-legged locusts with stubby antennae on their head. You can see it here in this picture. It's right there. That's what they looked like. And sort of gives the impression of horns. And as Quatermass and Roney then examine the remains, they theorize that these aliens may have come from a planet habitable 5 million years ago, not surprising given the date. And they make the leap, the sort of assumption, that it could have been Mars. So while they're clearing the equipment out of the craft, the drill operator triggers more of this poltergeist activity, and he eventually starts running through the streets in a panic until he finds sanctuary in a church. Quatermass and Roney find him, and he describes visions of the insects, aliens, killing each other en masse, some kind of giant alien killing festival. So as Quatermass investigates the history of the area, he finds accounts dating back to medieval times about devils and aliens that are all centered in incidents where the ground had been disturbed near this thing. And what he suspects is that the psychic projections of these beings had remained on the alien ship and are being seen by those who come into contact with it. So Quatermass then decides to use Roney's optoencephalograph, which was a technobabble thing. It was supposed to a device that you would attach to somebody's head and would allow you, on like a TV screen, to see what that person is seeing. And so they use Roney's assistant, Barbara Judd, who's very, very susceptible to this stuff, and they see this vision for themselves. They record a violent purge by the Martian hive to apparently root out unwanted mutations. And that's the part when you get into, when I was watching the Hammer version of this, that sucker was something that just freaked me out. It was one of the ones that freaked me out. And Larry says every alien at the time was assumed to be coming from Mars. Yeah. I mean, there was a time right up until the beginning of my lifetime, until they sent probes to Mars, when they thought Mars might be habitable with a thin atmosphere. Now we find out it's totally uninhabitable without terraforming that would probably take centuries at best. But Quatermass concludes that in its most primitive phase, mankind was visited by this race of Martians, and some of the pre-humans were taken away, genetically altered to give them abilities like telepathy, telekinesis, and other psychic powers. And then they were returned to Earth, and this buried artifact is just one of the ships that had crashed on the way to Earth. Because they had their home dying over on Mars, and they did not have the ability to the Martians did not have the ability to live on Earth. You can see kind of here, that isn't something that's going to live on Earth very easily. Yep, Professor X from X-Men, only on a grand scale, absolutely, yeah. So what they did was they tried to change humanity's ancestors to have minds and abilities similar to the aliens, but with bodily forms that adapted to life on Earth. But then the aliens became extinct before completing their work. And so as the human race then bred and evolved, a percentage of them retained their psychic abilities, and they surface only sporadically. And so for centuries, this ship had been occasionally triggering these dormant abilities, which explain the reports of poltergeists and ghosts. And people were unknowingly using their own telekinesis to move objects around. And the ghost sightings were traces of a racial memory. That's a pretty big deal, actually, when you think about it. He's saying that humanity owes its current existence to interference by Martians. So he takes this story to the British authorities, and Colonel Breen in particular find that this whole thing is just ridiculous. And despite the fact that they've been shown pictures, the recordings of Barbara's visions, They believe the craft is simply a Nazi propaganda weapon. The alien bodies were fakes designed to give exactly the impression that Quatermass had succumbed to. And so they decide, in their infinite wisdom, to hold a media event right there at the dig to stem the rumors that are already spreading about this thing. Quatermass does not like this. He warns that if the implanted psychic powers in the human race, there could be an ingrained compulsion to enact this wild hunt, the one that freaked me out, which was a racial purge. But the media event goes on ahead regardless. And so they have power cables that string into the craft that fully activate it for the first time. And the glowing and humming, it starts to be like a living thing. It turns very bright white. And it does, in fact, awaken the ancient racial programming. And those Londoners who are anywhere near fall under its influence. They merge into a group mind, and they begin to telekinetically go on a mass murder against those whose genes do not carry the ones that they do, as they consider them to be ethnically impure. So Breen, well, he stands transfixed when this happened, and eventually is totally consumed. The last time we see him, he is apparently practically mummified and dead. And the craft itself is slowly melting away, and at that point, an image of the Martian devil just floats in the sky over London, which again, when they did this in color, in Hammer, that one really freaked me out. The Alien Purge images and that image just freaked me out. And it's why I went on this whole escapade with all of these Quatermass reviews. Well, they start to have fires and rioting in London, and Quatermass himself succumbs to the mass psychosis. And he even attempts to kill Roni, who doesn't have this gene and is immune from the influence. However, fortunately, Quatermass is a very strong-willed guy, and Roni manages to get him out of his trance. And he remembers the legends of the demons and the fact that they have a problem with iron and water, at least historically. And Roni proposes that a sufficient mass of iron connected to the wet earth, and then this device may be sufficient to short-circuit it. Well, Quatermass gets a length of iron chain, and tries to go down and do it, but is ultimately overcome by the compulsion. So Roni, he manages to go up to the apparition, hurls it in the chain at it, and that results in both he and the spacecraft being reduced to ashes. And then at the conclusion of the episode, something I'll talk about in a bit of cringe moments, Quatermass gives a live television broadcast at the end, and he delivers a warning directly to the camera. If we cannot control the inheritance within us, then this will be their second dead planet. And scene. That is the whole plot of it. It's spread out over 6 episodes, and if you watch them today, as a modern viewer, the pace is going to seem very slow. But the pace at that time was normal. This was a normal pace for a TV show or serial at that time. Now, if you watch the Hammer films, and it's out there, if you search around a little bit. If you watch the Hammer films, putlockertv.to, putlockertv.to, you'll find that what they've done is the same guy who wrote it, Nigel Neal, who wrote the serial, writes the movies. And he has sped up the plot so that it fits into 2 hours. He's also eliminated 1 or 2 things that are kind of important. But on TV, as a weekly aired series for 6 weeks, this was the pace that people expected. They did not expect a frantic pace where every 10 minutes you had some action, which is what we have now. But my cringe moments, always like to get those out of the way first. My cringe moments, I really only have one. And it's the conclusion when Quatermass is talking to the audience directly. He's not just talking to the audience inside, the context of the film. Clearly also giving the audience themselves a message. That's kind of heavy-handed. It's Roddenberry-esque almost, although Roddenberry wouldn't come around for another 10 years with Star Trek, but very heavy-handed, and I didn't like that so much. I think you could have gotten away with not saying that. Yes, Larry, the Martians wanted Earth, but couldn't live on Earth, so they were trying to replicate something that could live on Earth, but with their same sort of intelligence and hive mind, apparently. and just never got it finished. So that's why human beings, and it's a big story point in this, that's why human beings owe our existence to the Martians. We are essentially descended from a group of hominids who had been experimented on by the Martians, had these psychic things put in, and had their intelligences increased. So, in terms of great moments, really, because that's my only real cringe moment, again, approaching this as somebody from the time period who's expecting this slower pace, who is expecting these things to, seeing these things as new ideas, because we've certainly seen them later in science fiction. I think virtually everything else is a great moment. It holds up very well, in my opinion. Writer on this. Always like to talk about the writers first, because without a writer, if you don't have a good story, you can have all the great production values you want, and you still ain't got nothing. Last Jedi. So the writer on this was Nigel Neal, and he wrote all of the Quatermass serials, and in fact went on to write one other much later. His IMDb is 1951 to 2005 with 44 writer credits, with multiple TV series and multiple miniseries and multiple episodes, with a fairly wide range of things that he worked on, not just science fiction. In 2001, he won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Bram Stoker Awards, and he has 2 BAFTA nominations. Now, apparently, I did not know this because I didn't know the history well enough. Again, I try to put myself back in time. But there are stuff you will miss. Particularly if you're not up on what was going on in Great Britain at the time. Neal was using this concept of the Martian wild hunt very explicitly as an allegory for recent Notting Hill race riots in Great Britain. Larry says movies and TV shows had to have a moral, so they outright had to preach sometimes. Yeah, they did. Again, it's the only real cringe moment I have. Is just like, okay, we didn't need to hear that. I think we all figured that out just watching them film. But yeah, you see it. It's common in TV. You see it still sometime today, even in movies and TV shows. And I mentioned Roddenberry because Gene Roddenberry often was really heavy-handed with his stuff on Star Trek. Again, he was using this as an allegory for things that were going on at the time. And I will talk about some of the reaction to that, because there was. Now, leaving that aside, because I didn't know that as I watched this at all, you have to say that this is very good writing. Of the 3 Quatermass serials, this is, I think, hands down the best. It is the creepiest. It is the one that has the most interesting, what were at the time for TV, new ideas. I think it holds up well, and I think his writing was very, very good. He, at this point, knew, okay, we're going to be able to do a bigger scope because we have the ability to pre-shoot these scenes. And so he wrote those as they made sense, put more action on the screen than we saw off, and was able to do the parts that were live very, very well. The plotting is good, the pace is good. Again, assuming that you're coming to this knowing that everything you're watching on TV has roughly this type of pace. It isn't this frenetic, constantly got to do something pace. They get slowed down. And so when they did, he came up, because it's interesting, they also didn't do mid-episode commercials. They still don't on Doctor Who. And so, they didn't have to have this issue that we do in American TV, where you have to have a very specific 2 or 4 act structure where you will build things up to a climax and then have something happen that will keep the viewer through the commercial, and then you'll start the whole thing over again. So they didn't have to do that. His pacing was for a half-hour show, and so it works very well. You can think of this basically as a 6-act drama in 6 different parts. Yes, there were 6 episodes of this story. If you watch it back-to-back altogether, it is 3 hours long. And for me, it was the 3 hours that I had no problem watching whatsoever. I thought it was very, very good, and I thought the plotting was really good. Getting into some of our characters, we have Andre Morel, who plays Professor Bernard Quatermass this time around. Quinn Martin, new 4 acts in TV episodes. Yes, Quinn Martin shows actually said at the beginning of each act, that when he come back from the commercial, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. And in fact, if you watch the studio edition of Star Trek's second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, which does not include the theme song that we expect, The theme song from that is my show's theme song. And it also had a couple of, cut little bits and pieces that were cut. But one of the things that was always cut is they also in that used Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. They actually said it right at the beginning after every commercial. They would tell you what act it was, just like a Quinn Martin production. I think that was probably an attempt on Roddenberry's part to mimic some of the success that Quinn Martin Productions had had, and so by putting it in, made it look a little bit more serious. Fortunately, they got rid of it. It would have been terrible in actual broadcast. But Quinn Martin did it, and in the studio edition of Where No Man Has Gone Before, which does not ever get aired. You can find it. It's on DVD or Blu-ray now. I've forgotten where they released it. I have a copy. I have actually had a copy of that thing since the early 1990s. I had known about it before. I had seen it at conventions, and somebody got that sucker and telesoned it onto a video cassette, and I had had a copy for a long time. But it is finally out there now. You can get it. You can watch it. It's very interesting to see some of those differences. In fact, I think if you search here on YouTube, you'll probably find people that have put those the cut parts on YouTube. I'm pretty sure that they're here if you look. So Andre Morel played Professor Bernard Quatermass this time around, a different actor than the previous one, who is a different actor from the previous one. His IMDb goes 1938 to 1978, the year he died, so he kept working all the way through. He had 136 acting credits, which included, by the way, 3 episodes of Doctor Who from the William Hartnell era, the first Doctor. He did largely film until 1954, and then TV and TV miniseries. And one of the films that he was in, among others, is The Bridge Over the River Kwai, which is a very well-regarded film. And he was probably also doing a lot of stage work. Now, I always want to point out, because he had 136 acting credits, so I like to point out to people. You'll hear it say me in damn near every review when I'm going to do something on a good movie. 136 acting credits over his time period was very, very good. He put him into a group of very small actors who can actually make money acting. Most of them don't. I had a really good year one time when I was an actor. I made $1,500 whole dollars at my craft. That was good. For most actors, they just wait tables, and you will never know their names unless you're someplace upscale where the waiter signs the check, and then they hand it over to you. Otherwise, you will never know the names of the thousands of actors out there who go on auditions, never get a job, go and work on their craft, hopefully get some stage work to keep themselves moving, but probably never actually support themselves in acting. So Andre Morel was somebody who was supporting himself in acting, and that makes him a small number of actors. He got no awards. His performance here, I think, is very good. I think he's got a very good performance. To me, of the 3 actors who played Quatermass, I think he probably does the best job. Wait tables or be an IT expert? Yeah, well, I just quit. I quit because I like money, and there's money in IT. But I also didn't have what it takes. I really didn't. And I realized that early on, and then I said, screw this. I'm going to go make real money. At what had been at the time my second love, IT, but pretty much became my first. But Morel's performance here, I think, is very good. I think, for me, he is the best of the 3 Quatermasses in these serials. I think he does well at portraying a guy who is very, very angry that his life's work, which was this British rocket group, is now being completely taken over by the military. And I think he does a very good job of that. Half a second, I'm going to try to fix my... And it's just spinning. Okay, I like to have a video monitor of seeing what I'm seeing that's going out live, and it's just spinning on me, because YouTube does that sometimes, and I know it's probably fine, but I still want to be able to see it. So half a sec while I wait for this page to reload, and so I can see it out of the corner of my eye. Anyway, Morel's performance here, as I say, I think he's probably the best Quatermass of the 3. I think he does a really good job, as I say, of portraying a guy who is watching his life's work being completely taken over by the military against his will. I think he does a very good job of that. Thank you, Larry, for telling me the video looks fine. I assume it usually does. It's just, I like to be able to see that out of the corner of my eye that something's moving. So I don't always trust what YouTube does early on. Before my previous show was completely ripped off the YouTube, I would occasionally have a lot more problems with that than I do now. He also, Morrell does a very good job of, getting taken over by aliens and alien mind is something that's a little difficult to do and do it well and, actually sell it. But he does do it. He sells it. I think that works well, too. He's one of the smartest guys in the room. Obviously, he's one of the smartest guys in the room. He's really the first guy to say, hey, wait a minute. You're dating this at 5 million years, and that skull we just found was practically inside the ship. That means this thing must have been here 5 million years ago. And he's one of the first people to put stuff like that together. He's very good at that. So I like his performance quite a lot. Then we have Cease Linder. His full name is Cecil, but they called him Cease. He was credited as Cease everywhere. Cease Linder. His IMDb is 1953 to 1992. He died in 1992, so he was working all the way through. 152 acting credits, almost exclusively television, British TV until the late 50s and early 60s. And then he was doing a mix of American and British television. Yep, he was a Bond actor. He was in a Bond movie. Yep, he was there. I think this is probably a picture from one of the Bond movies. And he did a lot of stage work before 1953 that I didn't get into because that is a whole other rabbit hole to climb down. One thing about him, he is portraying a Canadian here. Now, you have to understand that until World War II, the UK was an empire. It was the British Empire. It was Goldfinger, was that it? I didn't catch it. I knew he'd been in one. But Goldfinger. The British Empire existed until roughly World War II. And there was a saying that was true. Because Britain held so many different... Oh, he played Felix Leiter? I did not catch that at all. Oh, that's interesting, considering what I did a couple of weeks ago. Or I've forgotten when I had that one actor who played Felix Leiter who had his legs gnawed off by sharks. This Felix Leiter did not have his legs gnawed off by sharks. British Empire still existed, and there was a saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that was true, because they had so many different colonies and so many different territories all over the world that at some point during the day, the sun was shining on it, no matter where you were. CIA contact in Miami Beach. Man, I've totally missed that. I totally missed it. As I say, he was a Canadian. He was a Canadian, and that was a good choice here, because sometimes when they get somebody in who's, basically got an American-type accent. Canadians are a little bit different, obviously. Today we know, tuck a boot stuff instead of about and things like that. But here he's doing what amounts to sort of a generic American accent that you would hear either in Canada or the U.S. And it was a good call on their part to do that, because sometimes when you get British actors, particularly in that period, who are doing Americans, their accents sound wrong. If you really want to see it horrible, go watch Doctor Who. Oh gosh, the Gunfighters, where they went to the OK Corral, or Patrick Troughton's last episode, something about war, where they have different, like the Southern, the Confederate Army is there, and they sound horrible. I mean, they're clearly British actors trying to do a Southern American accent, and it sounds terrible. And that can happen even with the good ones. Even today in Doctor Who, it isn't so much that their accents sound bad. It's that they get the wording wrong. They're using British idiomatic expressions and the way that British people would do intonation. And so by having a Canadian, legitimately a Canadian, doing this role was a good thing. All of that just goes out the window. He sounds perfect all the time. And he won no awards, despite playing Felix Leiter and CIA contact in Miami Beach in Goldfinger. His performance here, I think, is very good. He is perfectly playing a guy who is an archaeologist and is deeply concerned with moving anything around, with touching anything, with making sure that everything is absolutely pristine. He plays that perfectly. That is his main motivation throughout the entire film, is how can I get this stuff and how pristine can I make it? And oh my God, these soldiers are screwing everything up. They're just digging and they're crushing stuff and all these finds are being lost, and he's all about that. And he plays that perfectly. A lot of actors, if they play, you have to know going into it. That's what real archaeologists do. It's not like Indiana Jones, who just kind of smashes things from time to time. It's, oh my God, this is fine. Hold on. Nobody touch it. Let's get over here. Very carefully take it out. He's all about that and about preserving things, and he's very good at it. He plays that very well. And at the end, he's the guy who saves the day. He is a guy that you see throughout, and you get to like, and he saves the day. He is the hero of this story. Now, the next one is kind of interesting. We have British Vivian Leigh, wasn't a good-sounding Southern belle in Gone with the Wind or Streetcar Named Desire. I think she did a good job, yes. But, particularly on BBC productions, when you see British people doing American accents, it sounds off. Even today, like I say in Doctor Who, they get the accent right. The accent sounds correct, but intonation is wrong. It's really hard to describe. I have an ear for this, because I can do a fair amount of accents if I want to, and not always great. Because particularly when you get into British, I don't know some of the more specific accents. I can do some of them, but they have a lot. And the intonation is just wrong. There is, if you're a Scotsman, you tend to lilt upward at the end of sentences, And if you're doing that, and you're a Scotsman playing a person who is not a Scotsman, if you're not really good at it, and some people are, then the lilting comes in. The use of certain words and idiomatic expressions tend to come out wrong. But again, here we have a Canadian, legitimately, so we don't have this problem at all. Then, as Colonel Breen, Cockney Michael Caine. Yeah, well, here's one. Here's one that I heard somebody do that I thought was very funny. If you want to speak like Michael Caine, you can only say a few words at a time. That was beautiful. You want to speak like Michael Caine, you only speak a few words at a time. It's so accurate. So, as Anthony, we have Anthony Bushnell, who plays Colonel James Breen. This guy was kind of interesting. His IMDb is 1924 to 1964, with a very large gap in 1939 to 1944, in which he served in the British Army in World War II and rose to the rank of major, which is nothing to shake his stick at. And he preferred, in fact, when he was on set, they would often back then, because you didn't necessarily call the actors by their first names. If they were well-known actors, you might call them Mr. such and such, Mr. Morell, Mr. Linder, etc. The crew would call them that. He preferred, when he was on set, to be called Major Bushnell. So that's what he actually did. He'd say, if somebody would say, Mr. Bushnell, he said, no, Major Bushnell, because that's what he'd risen to in the UK Army. He had 67 acting credits, so much like the last ones we were seeing, he was a worker. He did film until 1958 and started doing a lot of British TV with Quatermass Experiment. He also has 11 director credits and 5 producer credits. So again, a guy who had a fair amount of experience and no awards. And his performance is really good. I think this is something where, as a guy who not only served in World War II and rose to the rank of major, but also really valued that, enough that he would tell people in cast and crew, you should be calling me Major Bushnell, and not my first name or last, Major Bushnell. I think this was clearly a character that was very close to him. This is something that he could easily play because he'd been in that army, he knew how it worked, and he certainly would know what a colonel does and how a colonel operates. He's a major playing a major. He's actually a major playing a colonel, but, again, when you've spent as much time as he did in World War II, playing a colonel is not going to be a problem. And he does that well. This is one of those places where you almost wonder if Doctor Who hasn't ripped something off. If you took and replaced Bushnell with, I don't know, Brigadier Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, you would find a very similar character. The difference is with the Brigadier, he has a more open mind about this crazy stuff, and Colonel Breen simply does not. And he's overcome in the end, and that's that. But clearly a character, I think, that he could easily play because he was familiar with everything and how that operated. He was, in fact, himself a major and took it so seriously that he made people around the set call him Major Bushnell. So, a very good performance on his part. The last of our real main characters, because there are a ton of characters in this one, the last of the real main characters is Christine Finn as Barbara Judd, who is the assistant of the archaeologist. She's his assistant. She has an IMDb that went 1949 to 1976 with 31 acting credits in IMDb, which include, by the way, 31 episodes of Thunderbirds, in which she did a variety of voices. I'll talk about Thunderbirds in a second. And she did multiple recurring ones, the most memorable of which, apparently, because I haven't seen Thunderbirds, a lot of it, was never my thing, was a character called Tintin. Now, not everything that she did is listed on IMDb. Now, until 1969, she did quite a lot of TV, and concurrently with that, she was doing a lot of stage work until sometime after 1976. She was also doing BBC radio productions in the 1960s. Now, in terms of her face, and why we didn't see her on screen that much, is she is yet another ingenue/leading lady type who aged out. However, in her case, she had been doing a ton of theater before and after this. Excuse me. She had done a ton of voice work for BBC Radio, and when I looked her up, it became a rabbit hole. It turned into a rabbit hole because she became associated with a number of different live theater companies, where she was on the company of those live theaters. So somebody who was working quite a lot, despite the fact that she doesn't have a lot of IMDb credits, she was still doing a lot of stage work, and you can find evidence of that out there. And it turned into a bit of a rabbit hole for me. Just tracking it all down because, no, she couldn't wait. She was doing this, she was doing that. Oh, I'm finding stuff about her in theater here and there. Okay. She won no awards. Now, her performance here is fine. She's playing a woman who is a very good assistant. When she's doing that, it's really nice, very believable. She shares Roni's, passion for making sure that these things are, well preserved when they come out and preserving them for future study and all that. She's very, very good at that. The moments when she's overcome by the hive mind seem a bit over the top from time to time. But that's a hard thing to play. I mean, how do you play, I'm being overcome by aliens with 3 legs that want me to go out and kill people that don't have telekinesis or whatever? I mean, it's a hard thing to play. It seemed a little over the top, but it wasn't bad. And as I said, the rest of her performance, she was working very well with. A pre-Doctor Who companion. Yeah, you could almost see her as a Doctor Who companion. Yeah, you could almost see that. A modern one, not the ones necessarily that they have in the 60s, because those guys tend to just scream a lot. Those girls, rather. But some of them, Zoe, people like that, you could see her as a Doctor Who companion. Yeah. Again, Doctor Who, and they've said it, and I'll talk about it later when I get to production and impact aspects of this, definitely had an impact on this show. I mean, the show definitely had an impact, and not just on Doctor Who. It had an impact. Then we have everybody else. And if you go through the IMDb, scroll, it's tons of people. There were a lot of extras, a lot of people with smaller parts that we see from time to time. There's the bomb disposal team. And really, of all this, everybody else, the only person that's really worth talking about very much is Captain Potter. He's the guy who is originally, when they get there, in charge of trying to figure out what kind of unexploded bomb this is. He was played by John Stratton. We see him throughout. His performance is fine. He's playing a British officer who's completely out of his depth. And when Colonel Breen comes in, He says, you want to take over, dude? Fine. I don't know what the hell I'm dealing with here. This is too weird. And we do see him do some sort of heroic things with our leading lady, with Barbara. He does some nice things with her in terms of she's passed out someplace. He's very concerned. He tries to get her out of the way. So that was fine. Everything was cool in that. By the way, I should mention that Christine Finn, who played Barbara, I didn't write it down. I thought I'd remember it, but I didn't. She has a 6 degrees of Star Trek because she was in Thunderbirds, which was a super marionation project of Jerry and Sylvia Anderson. They called it Super Marionation. It was puppets. Some of them are good. Thunderbirds is not a bad show. I haven't seen much of it. It's not a bad show. Don't bother watching the stupid live action one they did. It's terrible. But it's not a bad show. So Jerry and Sylvia Anderson did that show. They also did Space 1999 in the 1970s, which was a live action show. And there's 2 degrees of Star Trek there. It was starred Martin Landau and Barbara Bain in Space 1999. They also starred in the 1960s TV series Mission Impossible, in which, after Star Trek was canceled, Leonard Nimoy played the recurring character of Paris. The second 6 degrees of Star Trek is that the second season of Space 1999 was produced by Fred Freiberger, who rather infamously produced the third season of Star Trek, the one that most people want to forget most of the episodes about. So that is her 6 degrees of Star Trek. Now, in terms of production here, the guy who was the director and producer was Rudolph Cartier. Now, he was director and producer of Quatermass 2. He was director on Quatermass Experiment. And they made him the producer because on Quatermass Experiment, he bumped heads quite a lot with the producer on that one. So they just said after that, screw it. We're gonna just let him be producer-director on this. Mission Impossible was on the same sets and studio of Star Trek. Yes, it sold at the same time. It was almost a sister show. Those cast members would see each other from time to time, and that's why when Star Trek was canceled, Leonard Nimoy was able to get that job. So he was producer and director, Rudolph Cartier. Now, his IMDb goes 1928 to 1976, with a very large gap from 1935 to 1948. One assumes military service almost certainly. He has 56 director credits, 33 producer credits, 40 writer credits, and he did mostly, almost exclusively television with multiple miniseries like this one, multiple TV series with multiple episodes, and again, a wide range. He did not just do science fiction. These 3 serials he did science fiction for, but they were not just science fiction. They're not just science fiction in his resume. And he won no awards. In terms of his direction, now there's 2 parts of the direction that you have to consider on this. First part is the live part, where he's sitting in a control booth, basically doing some level of cinematography on the fly. You do have your cameras set up in certain places, but then they have to move around on the set. You get a shot here from camera 1, and then camera 1 needs to go around behind the other cameras, get into place for another shot. So you're kind of doing all this stuff on the fly. And if the actor misses their mark, you have to tell the camera, move a little bit over this way or move in or whatever. So there's that part of the direction to consider. And in the live portions, I think it's very good. You're seeing how they placed cameras sometimes on this. It left me scratching my head. You're seeing the exterior of this ship, and then you're seeing a camera from the interior. And they would sometimes have one on either side of this thing. It was basically an enclosed cylinder. And so they'd have a camera on one end, a camera on the other, and they would be able to switch back and forth when they needed to see different things. And it wasn't always the same. They would have the camera in here at one point, shoot it, take the camera out while they're doing other things on some other shots and put it in the front. So I thought that was really, really good. Larry says, some say the live-action Anderson series are more wooden than the marionation shows. Well, I tell you, I think back before they were canceled, before it was killed. And by the way, I've discovered I can't upload a lot of my videos that were on my previous channel. YouTube apparently has something that keeps a record of those types of videos. They're going on the Internet Archive. It's the only place I can think of that isn't even remotely safe. So for a very long period of time, probably the next couple of years, I'll be uploading all of my older videos to the Internet Archive and archiving the new videos there as well. At some point, I'll catch up. I don't know when. But in terms of that, I think I did a Space 1999 one, and I talked about Barbara Bain. I don't know if she could act, but based on Space 1999, I was never even remotely interested in finding out. She was wooden and terrible with only one expression for every single thing that happened in that show. And as you say, it seemed more wooden than the Super Mario Nation ones. Even Martin Landau, who's a brilliant actor, couldn't save that. Just couldn't save it. So, Cartier's direction here in terms of the live stuff, I think, is really good. And then when you get into the stuff that is pre-recorded, some of it is a little conventional. But again, you're working with this limitation of the budget that they had, which I'll talk about momentarily, and also the fact that they had, time constraints. But what they did was very good, and there's a couple of them. There's some really good cinematography, like when that workman who goes nuts, and he's running down the street. They get a low angle of him while he's running past. And then there's one that may have been achieved on set. I don't know for sure. It probably was, but a cool special effect. They end one episode with this workman basically falling unconscious, or more or less so, on the street or on a gravel road. And all around him, just, sort of rippling around where they've got a shot of basically his hand, most of his arm. And all around this, the ground is just rippling. I thought that was great. It was great both from a cinematography point of view and from a cliffhanger point of view. It was a very good thing to do. Like I say, and in this case, instead of just being him calling all the shots, he had the opportunity to work with the cinematographer as well, which I'm going to talk about on those filmed portions. So I think the film portions are also very well done. When you get to the big crowd scenes and people going nuts, all that pre-film stuff, very good and very well done, I thought. So good direction all the way around. In terms of production, now the budget on this was £17,500. Now, if you converted that into dollars at that time, that would have been about $22,000. If you converted it into modern dollars in 2018, that would be about $191 million. Not a large budget, even by today's standards. Making something like this, a six-part serial with this kind of story and that kind of scope, on only about $190K would be pretty amazing. That would be pretty good. So you have to give them credit for using their budget extremely wisely. The ratings on this, well, it was watched by an average of 9.6 million viewers with a peak of 11 million for the final episode. Now, I just mention this because I've been talking about it in my Doctor Who reviews. I'll pull out the ratings. Compare this to season 11 of Doctor Who, which closed out as we were tripling down, because it started out with 11 million on the first episode, which makes sense. First female doctor, lots of people are going to watch. But it trickled its way down to about 7 million. So this was doing better in terms of ratings back then than Doctor Who would be doing now. Now, admittedly, today they have a lot more options. Back then it was the BBC and that was all. And they didn't have many competitors until the 1960s. But here, now, 7 million, which is not bad. It's not going to get the series canceled or anything. But compare it to this thing where it was 9.6 million on average with 11 million for the last episode. Larry says, I liked Star Trek Next Generation was an episode where Enterprise would blow up before each commercial break in the time loop. Yeah, that was fun. I know the episode you're talking about. Yeah, I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember the episode. Well, I can say 4-act structure, you got to get something to hook a viewer. Is the Enterprise going to stop this time? Nope. Boom. Wait for the next commercial and start again. So, yeah. But that one shot at the end of that episode with his arm and the ground just rippling. I mean, I'm pretty sure I know how they did that shot, but it was still kind of creepy. This telekinetic thing was going on. It was affecting the ground around him, which was kind of cool. Things about the production in general here. Each episode was predominantly live, and it was done from Studio One at the BBC's Riverside Studios. What you have to understand is the BBC would acquire different buildings over time, and they weren't necessarily sound stages or anything like that. They would turn them into sound stages. If you watch, for example, An Adventure in Space and Time, which, again, I very much suggest you do. You'll see that some of these things were so small. The Doctor Who set was so small that they made a joke in the film. I don't know that anybody ever said it. The director says, how can we shoot on that stage? It's smaller on the inside. It's kind of an end joke. But some of these stages were not very well set up for that. In this case, they did get them some pretty good sound stages. The episodes were rehearsed from Tuesday through Saturday at a different sound stage. And then camera rehearsals, which is basic dress rehearsals, making sure the cameras are in place, the directors, actors are all doing their stuff. They would do 1 or 2 of those in the morning and the afternoon of the transmission. So you'd rehearse. Then the day that it was going to be transmitted, you would do essentially a run-through with the cameras, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, make sure you got everything right, and then you would do the thing live there that evening. Again, not every scene was live. Some of them, in fact, a fair amount of this was shot on 35mm film and then inserted during the performance. And most of these were scenes that were on location or sets that were just too technically complex and expansive to do live. Now, they did some of this at Ealing Studios, which was someplace that still exists today, and that is where they worked with a cinematographer, A. Englander. Pre-filming is also used to show the passage of time, particularly in the second episode, where the archaeological dig is at one studio is at one level, right? They dug down a certain level and then unearthed this thing. Then they move over to another set in another sound stage, which is much deeper and has the whole thing excavated. So it's very good use of that. Let's see. Larry says, Superman stage in 1977 big enough. Yeah. Well, the stages when they made Superman, obviously, Pinewood and all of those were much, much bigger. Yeah, absolutely. Now, this was made just before videotape became the standard at BBC. And all 6 of these episodes were preserved for possible repeat showing because they learned after the first 2 that people wanted to see these things again. So they did this by tele-recording them on 35mm film. Now, this was considerably more technologically down the chain than even Telesin. Telesin is where you're essentially playing the film and pointing a camera at it to record it. This was worse because what they did was they would get a specially synchronized camera because you had to have that because of the motion. If you ever see in old movies with TVs in the background, if they don't have the TV's refresh rate set correctly, you will see lines going up them. So they would have this special camera that was synchronized for that refresh rate. They would just point the camera at a video monitor and let it roll. They refined that throughout the 1950s, but this does mean that these recordings are of a fairly high quality. And this was then later on, I think within the last 10 years, taken on. Somebody did digital restorations. The ones that you see on Internet Archive are not those. You have to go buy and pay for those if you want to find them. I did not never find a copy that was that good. But they're still in pretty good shape, even before the digital restoration. So they did have digital restoration. And the other thing about this is that this is Quatermass in the Pit is the last time that writer Nigel Neal would be collaborating with Rudolph Cartier as he done for the previous ones. British refresh rates was 50 hertz, 50 frames per second. Yeah. And of course you got 35mm film going through at probably a different refresh rate. So again, you had this problem of if you don't have it synchronized, you get to see lines moving up on your monitors. So that's what they had to do. The cinematographer for those filmed pieces was A. Englander. Now, he has an IMDb that went 1946 to 1967 with 56 camera and electrical department credits, which is how he is credited here. When you get into that credit, camera and electrical department credit, a lot of times that means on a movie that this was the guy who primarily sat behind the camera. The cinematographer told him what to do, and he got the shots. He was the guy who physically got the shots. Yup, USA, the refresh rate was totally different. 30 hertz, 30 frames per second, which is what I would like to be coming to you at instead of a crappy 10 frames per second. Please buy the laptop. Or actually, I'm going to get into how to support me financially. I'm going to rant about Patreon a little later on. But yes, they had different synchronization rates on both sides of the pond. Made life just generally miserable if you were trying to, convert from one to the other. Early times when Doctor Who first starting aired, the aspect ratio was wrong because the aspect ratio on NTC and PAL, which is the two different formats that were used, was different. And the refresh rates were different. And so if you just transcoded them without doing any extra work, it came out looking weird and wrong. Saw a lot of Doctor Who that way. PAL format was a little more rectangular. NTSC was a little more square. So if you took your rectangular PAL format, Doctor Who, and just transcoded over to the more square NTSC, you get squashed in. And that's what a lot of early Doctor Who looked like before they started doing it right. Now, of course, it's a non-issue with our current 16:9 aspect ratio. But back then, they were totally different standards. Anyway, in terms of that credit, like I say, a camera and electrical department. A movie, that usually means you're the guy who's sitting behind the camera. However, he is reported as basically being the cinematographer here. So there's a lot of leeway in terms of what that means sometimes. Now, he did, by the way, do 2 Doctor Who episodes as a cinematographer. 2 of them in the John Pertwee Third Doctor era. One of which was The Claws of Axos, and the other one which was the Ambassadors of Death. I have seen both of these. He has 23 cinematographer credits outright, and he did exclusively television, largely serials or mini-serials, and I think, looking at his IMDb, he would be what I would call sort of under contract to the BBC. And that's different from what we think of as under contract. I think he just worked for the BBC. And what they would do would say, okay, we need you to go over and do this show. Okay, done with that, we need to go over and do this show. He's just working for the BBC. That's how his IMDb looks like to me. He's done so much BBC work that I have to say, he must have just been working for BBC. Which would have been a good gig, by the way, back then. That meant he was getting paid. Whether he was working or not, he was still going to get paid. And he was working because they didn't let these guys sit on the bench. So he was working, and that would have been a good job to get. Anybody in theater, film, TV, etc., if you can get a job where you're getting paid from week to week and you don't have to worry about that paycheck going away, as long as you do your job right, that's a great job to have, So he also did not win any awards. And he is cinematographer for the pre-filmed sequences. And again, always with cinematographers, not being there, I do not know. But you always hope there is a collaboration between the cinematographer and the director. Director says the shots that he wants. The cinematographer's job is to get those shots. And sometimes there's a collaboration between the two of them that hopefully will make things come out even better. Don't know if that was going on here. So on the pre-shot sequences, the only thing you can fall back on for a cinematographer is the 2 basics. Could you see what you were supposed to see? Did you know what you were supposed to look at? And yes, both of those things are yes, definite yes. Even in some of the stuff that's dark, that's occurring at night, and they did do actual night shooting for this. There is no day for night shots where they put a filter over something happening in the day. They shot these at night. And those are night shooting, while it seems easy, especially today, when you can manipulate lighting and all of that stuff in post, just digitally, and it happens a lot. Back then, doing it meant doing it for real with lights and cameras and doing it in the right places. And sometimes it's hard to get shots like that. So he did a very good job, I thought. TV set fees helped pay the BBC people. Yes, in the UK, you did not and still do not, if I understand correctly, just watch TV. You pay a license to do it. If you want cable, which everybody has, you pay a license for that cable. You are licensing your ability to watch your television from the British Crown. Always have to remember, at the end of the day in Great Britain, no matter what else is going on, at the end of the day, everything is owned by the Queen, including people. Everything. They are subjects. They're not really, they're citizens, but they are also subjects. They're not like we think of in the United States as being free, independent people. They are ultimately owned by the Queen Whether they like to think about that or not, that's really what they are. You should listen to their national anthem sometime. Very informative from that respect. So again, cinematography here was good, I thought. Music is a very interesting one that went down a bit of a rabbit hole when I looked at it. I originally just was going to credit it to what it said in IMDb, Trevor Duncan. However, further research indicated to me that this was in fact a pseudonym used by BBC radio producer John, let me see if I can not stumble over this last name, John Trebilco. Hey, I didn't stumble. I did in my run-through. Most of the music was from stock. However, it also uses sound effects and electronic music that creates some of the atmosphere. And some of that still, to me, is really creepy. And those were created for the serial by the famous BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And those were overseen by people there. Quatermass was one of the productions for the BBC Radio Workshop and was the first time on British television that basically electronically done music was used in a science fiction production. And again, it being from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, I mean, they would go through eventually and do Doctor Who, and really are very renowned today. Was it a theremin? I don't know. I don't know what they actually used, but it sure was damn creepy to me. I still found it creepy today, even watching it. Even knowing what was going to come, I still found that pretty creepy. I thought it was pretty good. Production design is by Clifford Hatz. His IMDb is 1957 to 1976 with 47 PD credits, and that included lots of serials, lots of miniseries like this one, and no awards. His production design here is very good. Doing that dig in two different locales, I thought that was great. And the alien spacecraft itself, I thought that was really well done. It's a cylindrical shape with some projections and things like that on it. But the difference between this alien spacecraft and most alien spacecraft in the 1950s is, a lot of times if you see in science fiction movies, the alien the spaceships look like V2 rockets. That's where they were projecting forward. You always have to remember that whenever you're making one of these, you are projecting forward. You're taking your current technology and saying, what is that going to look like as we go forward? How is that going to change? So a lot of times in the 1950s, it looked like a V2 rocket because that's what they had to deal with. This one, however, while it is cylindrical in shape, is clearly not something like a V2 rocket. And the design, I think, is very nice. It's got a front part with projections on it that's sort of bulbous, and it connects to a larger cylindrical part that has this door in it, and then there's a back compartment. I thought that was all very, very well done. Very well done. In terms of the rest of the scenic design, it all works very well. Like I say, I'm impressed by both the two digs that he did, that A, had to match up in terms of some of the stuff that was on it, but B, also conveyed that, hey, okay, some time has passed and we've dug farther down. And that alien spacecraft. I just like the alien spacecraft because it was not a V2 rocket. It looked different in many ways. And it indicated, they indicated in dialogue that the projections that you see out the front probably were attached to other things that had simply decayed and gone away over the course of the last 5 million years that had been buried. Yep, Earth ships looked like V2 rockets too. Yeah, there were really two types of rockets that you saw in that period. They looked like V2 rockets, or they looked like flying saucers, because 1940s flying saucer sightings really took off. And so, it's really weird because you get to 1954 and Forbidden Planet, and that one has is a flying saucer for the good guys. Very unusual at that time. But I like the fact that the alien spacecraft did not really look like a V2 rocket, which was nice. I mean, it was sort of a story point. I think it's an unexploded bomb, and Colonel Breen's going around trying to figure out, okay, well, what have the Germans done here? It's clearly got to be German. What did they do here? Wow, they must have cooked up something really different, that we did not know about. And of course, Colonel Breen's an idiot, but Special effects for this very interesting thing happened. Special effects for this are by the BBC Visual Effects Department, which was formed by Bernard Wilkie and Jack Kine in 1954, largely as a result of these Quatermass things. Both of those guys worked on the previous Quatermass ones and then formed this whole production unit, the BBC Visual Effects Department. And so they were the ones who did special effects for this. Yep, Larry says, alien spaceships became flying saucers after all the sightings in 1940s and 1950s. Yep. And almost a huge amount of time, even in good movies, alien spaceships look like flying saucers. Those were the two things, V-2 rocket-like ships and flying saucers. So these two guys, Bernard Wilkie and Jack Klein, they started this whole production unit, BBC Visual Effects Department, and they were the ones that were doing visual effects for this. They pre-filmed most of the effects that were used for the live broadcast, and they also did all the practical effects at the various shooting stages, and also they designed these Martians. That's their design for the Martian creatures. That alone, on that design, I give them a lot of credit for. There's a lot of ways you could have gone with an alien from Mars. In War of the Worlds, we saw how they did one of them multiple times. Basically, a big blob with lots of, tentacles that can't survive on Earth because of the gravity. Well, here we have a very different kind of alien from Mars that also can't survive in Earth's gravity or atmosphere. So I thought it was a really good design. Similarly, there is a point at which, the alien spacecraft starts to basically glow really white and then kind of melt in on itself and become this thing. I thought that was really well done. So I cannot fault these guys at all for their special effects. I think for the time period, it was great. Does it hold up today? No, of course not. It's been 60 years. But you have to say, always, technology dates, and there's nothing you can do about it. Wardrobe supervisor here, I was not a costume designer, but a supervisor, was Pamela Glanville, and she has 4 costumer credits and wardrobe department credits, with Quatermass and the Pit being her last. And she has 2 costume designer credits. She did exclusively TV and won no awards. I would consider from looking at her IMDb that she's one of those people who was, again, working directly for the BBC. They would say, do this show, now go over and do this show, now go over and do this show, and so forth. So she was working directly for the BBC. Costumes here are mostly practical. They do reveal things about the people who are wearing them. One that sticks out at me is there's a woman, don't remember her name because she was in the thing for about 3 minutes, but she's busy trying to read tea leaves to predict the future, and she's wearing stuff that looks like kind of a frumpy housewife at the time that you would not take seriously about this sort of thing. And, of course, the military are all wearing contemporary to the era military uniforms. Those are all fine. It's a decent attention to detail because you can screw that up. I've seen TV shows and movies where they don't work very hard at what they're doing. You see the wrong rank insignia for somebody. You see the wrong types of medals on their chest that shouldn't be there for what they've done, or somebody who's too young to have a giant, bunch of medals and awards on their chest. I've seen them screw it up, and they didn't do that here. They were close enough to World War II. People who had worked on the show probably did service in World War II, or at least knew people who had. And so they were a lot more careful about that sort of thing. Similarly, the costumes that, Quatermass and Roni are wearing, very, very consistent with people who were essentially eggheads. They wore suits all the time. You wouldn't necessarily today, in an archaeological dig, see somebody wearing a suit with a lab coat. But they did back then. And so, it was something that told you a little bit about the character, that this is somebody who is basically an egghead, which is pretty cool. Makeup is attributed to Christine Hillcoat. Her IMDb is 1956 to 1978, with a very large gap between 1964 and 1974. She has 20 makeup department credits, and Quatermass in the Pit is her 5th. She did exclusively television, with many miniseries of anywhere from 1 to 15 episodes. She also worked on an evening news program. So she was doing makeup for the evening news programs every day from 1977 through 1978. Again, no awards. And again, I would suggest that she was probably working directly for the BBC. Her makeup is fine. There's nothing that jumps out at you here because, the really weird stuff tends to be the aliens, and the human beings are just made up in a way that would make sense. That just makeup is there so that, under lighting, they don't look flat, and so that all worked. You can't, not much to say about it. It was functional. There really wasn't anything in there that, was so out of the ordinary that you say, wow, look at that makeup. Now, something about the reception of this, after we finally get out of, the production aspects of it, reception of this, well, as I say, watched by 9.6 million viewers on average, peaking at 11 million for the final episode. Very, very, very well watched at that time. 10 million was a fracking smash hit. And so being in that vicinity of it was great. At the time, the Times of London had a television reviewer who really liked the opening episode and said the day afterwards, at first episode, he said, quote, Professor Bernard Quatermass, like all science fiction heroes, has to keep running hard if he is not to be overtaken by the world of fact. And he also went on to say that the episode was an excellent example of Mr. Neal's ability to hold an audience with promises alone, smooth, leisurely, and without any sensational incident. And he's absolutely right. There isn't anything on here that makes you, that, is so crazy. It all makes sense. If you can buy into this whole thing about the Martians, all makes sense. And he doesn't, Neil doesn't do anything insane with it. So I totally agree with him. However, as I said, Neil was intentionally using that thing about the hive mind and the big massacre as a allegory to things that were going on between race relations at the time. And there were some black leaders who were very upset, particularly by the first episode, because, and this is what the Times of London's Birmingham correspondent said, quote, leaders of the colored minorities here today criticized the BBC for allowing a report that race riots were continuing in Birmingham to be included in this fictional news bulletin during the first episode. So we actually had them talking about it, and they were a little bit ticked off. Myself, 2018, not knowing about this at all when I watched it, I didn't think twice about it. But knowing now as I do that he was intentionally using this as an allegory, I can kind of see where black leaders might get a little upset. In the year 2000, the British Film Institute included Quatermass in the Pit in its top 100 TV show list. It is at number 75. It's also apparently some kind of, I didn't quite get it, but it's some kind of sub category as well, in which it holds 20th place and what they describe as the drama that features a story which mined technology and folklore under the guise of genre, and it tackled serious themes of man's hostile nature and the military's perversion of science for its own ends. So, the theme of military takeover of a peaceful scientific project was also something that Patrick Studart wrote in 1988. He said, quote, last week I watched a British BBC drama in which a scientist fought against smirking government ministers and power-crazed army officers to stop his peaceful rockets research from being turned into a Star Wars vehicle to put missiles on the moon. They won, which he means the people who wanted to take it over won. So very well received at its time, still well received today, and has some stuff in it that really does stand the test of time. How many movies have you seen where, it turns out the good guys have been making something really amazing, and the moment the military finds out about it, they come in and take over. It's still got themes that resonate today, so it holds up well. That had a lot of influence. Oh man, did it have a lot of influence. Mark Gatiss, who was a modern Doctor Who writer, wrote in The Guardian in 2006, he quote, what sci-fi piece of the last 50 years doesn't owe Nigel Neal the writer, a huge debt? The ancient invasion of Quatermass in the Pit cast a huge shadow. Its brilliant blending of superstition and witchcraft and ghosts into the story of a 5 million-year-old Martian invasion is copperpot copper-bottomed genius. And a writer and critic of the time, Kim Newman, when he or she, I don't know for sure it is, was talking about Neil's career in a 2000 television interview. They cited Quatermass in the Pit as perfecting, quote, the notion of the science fiction detective story. There had been science fiction detective stories before, but this on TV was certainly one that was very good and heavily copied by everyone afterward. In fact, Newman, the same critic, said that this was also a huge influence on horror writer Stephen King. And Newman claimed that King had basically, quote, more or less rewritten Quatermass in the Pit for his novel The Tommyknockers. Now, I'm not familiar enough with with Stephen King to know, but it would be interesting to read The Tommyknockers and see if it is more or less a rewrite of Quatermass and the Pit. And then there's Doctor Who. Oh, God. You remember, Mark Gatiss that I was talking about, a modern Doctor Who writer. He said the story strongly influenced Doctor Who throughout its history, and I totally agree. Derek Sherwin, who was producer of Doctor Who in 1969, simply acknowledged that, yes, Quatermass and the Pit influence on the program because it moved them away from what he was calling wobbly jellies in outer space to more realistic stuff. And then in 1971 and 1977 on Doctor Who, there were two episodes, serials, because they always ran them in 4 to 6 parts back then. And there were 2 episodes. In 1971, The Daemons, and in 1977, The Image of Fendal, which share these following things with Quatermass' experiment. The unearthing of an extraterrestrial spacecraft, an alien race that interfered with human evolution, and was the basis for the legends of devils, demons, and witchcraft were also in it, and also an alien influence over human evolution. As I say, this is a story that we have now seen several times, but on British TV particularly, this is where it originated. It very much influenced. You can see its influence on Doctor Who still today. You can see its influence. There was more Quatermass after this. Now, after the Quatermass experiment, Nigel Kneale thought this, going to hang it up. This is it. But in the 1970s, he decided that there were some more things he could do with his character, and the BBC was to do a 4th Quatermass serial in 1972, but they didn't do it. They ended up not doing it. However, that was picked up for a 4-episode series called simply Quatermass that was made by Thames Television, because by that time, BBC wasn't the only game in town. I have seen the first episode on this one. It is really different. It is really, really different. It takes place in a near-term, it's a near-term science fiction show that takes place in kind of a dystopian world. Quatermass is out looking for his daughter in this world where, I don't know, the resemblance to Mad Max, at least in the first episode, is kind of, to me, uncanny. It's not the same kind of scope. You don't get, these guys in these amazing, souped up cars running around, but you do get some of the same stuff happening. It's a weird mix. I will eventually watch them all the way through because it is so much different than the other Quatermass serials. And, of course, as they had with all the others, and the one that grabbed my attention and caused me to do this series of reviews, Hammer Films did adapt this, amazingly enough, much later, 1967, 9 years after this was aired, with a totally different cast. And it was made in color, which was different. The previous 2 Quatermass adaptations had been in black and white. And that is today regarded by many reviewers as a classic of the genre for the way it blends science fiction and the supernatural. In the United States, for reasons I do not understand, instead of having Quatermass and the Pit as the title, they retitled it 5 Million Years to Earth. Now, I did watch this. I watched it after watching all 6 episodes of this one. It is got a faster pace. You have to. You've only got 2 hours to tell your story. And again, it scared the crap out of me one night. There used to be these, and so, there still is, I think, in Chicago. There's Sven Gulli in Chicago. But we had a guy, I'm not remembering his name, but it was like Elvira on the West Coast, right, who would host a late night show where they would show these old movies, and in between in commercials they would do their own little sketches and stuff like that. And I'm pretty sure I saw it on one of those. And boy, the whole alien thing and the aliens running wild completely freaked me out. Looking at it now, you know, I don't think that movie is as good as the serials. I think the serial is better. And of course, as a Fandi master, it no longer scares the crap out of me. But when I was a youngling, boy, did it. And it left an impression with me that made me want to do these reviews because of that. It is solely because that freaked me the frack out when I was a little kid. 5 Million Years to Earth movie from 1967 introduced you to Quatermass, Larry says. Yeah. Well, like I say, I didn't know anything about it. It was an old memory that I was just like, oh, man. Because I'm sure I had bad dreams. I'm sure I had bad dreams about that. And as I say, it stuck with me enough that I went, oh, okay, Quatermass in the Pit is hitting its 60th. Oh, let's work up to it. Let's do all the others and get there. So that's why I've been doing it. This is the climax of my own series about Quatermass. Now, in terms of books, well, nobody ever novelized this, but a script book of Quatermass in the Pit was released by Penguin Books in 1960, with a cover, by the way, that was drawn by Neil's brother, who was Brian, who was an artist. And then in 1979, this was reprinted by Arrow Books to coincide with the transmission of Quatermass, just Quatermass, that serial I was talking about, the dystopian one. And this also featured a new introduction by Neil. And amazingly enough, in 1997, a theater company called Creation Productions staged a live adaptation of Quatermass in the Pit in a quarry near Nottingham. If you watch older Doctor Who, they did a lot of shooting in gravel quarries. A lot of shooting in gravel quarries. So it amuses me no end that these guys decided to stage their production in a gravel quarry. So it makes perfect sense. It would work very well if you're going to do a stage production, because I heard that one. Somebody did this for stage? How do you take this and do it for stage? Oh, okay, you do it in a gravel pit. Got it. Okay, that might work. That might actually work. So, at the end of the episode, my end of my review, we usually ask ourselves, is it any good? Yes, I think this is very good. As I say, some things date. The sociology, the technology, the special effects, they always date. But the plot itself holds up very well. Its influence on Doctor Who is just about obvious when you see it. And to be honest, we see some of the same things in Star Trek. How many yet another godlike aliens did Star Trek have that had some influence on human evolution or human society? Now, whether or not that was necessarily directly copying this, I do not know. It was just one of Roddenberry's favorite themes. We saw it a lot. But we can still see it. It's still around today, and it all still works. And it still, to me, can frighten you. You know, the scene when the sound effects first start and people start getting woozy-eyed and what's going on with my head and trying to get away from it, that, to me, is still powerful enough to be a bit frightening. And also how they're taken over and when they run completely wild and mad, I think that's still pretty good and it holds up well. Zacharel was host in Philly and New York City. Oh, okay. No idea who that was. I'm trying to remember who our local guy was, because he had this thing he would always do at the end of his thing, at the end of his spiel, whatever it was before the commercial. He'd go, oh, I cannot remember his name. Hopefully one of my friends will remember and put a comment down for it. I do not remember his name. I should have looked that up. But in any case, I would definitely recommend watching this. It's out on the Internet Archive. The copies there they have aren't bad. If you want to see the ones that have been digitally restored, you can buy them off of Amazon. I don't have a link to it, but you can go out there and search for it. They're there. So, good series, well made, given the budget and the time and everything they had. I thought they did a really good job. And it is definitely something I would recommend watching. If you haven't seen it before, watch it. It's a good serial. So, now we get into my commentary for the evening. And I'm going to be pulling these out as clips, especially my second commentary, because everybody's talking about that one right now. But this one I want to talk about first. Facebook, between September 13th and September 25th, a bug on Facebook exposed 6.8 million users, private and public photos to roughly 1,500 third-party applications from 876 developers. Why are you still on Facebook? To begin with, it's literally addictive. I've talked about this in my video. Facebook and Twitter are brainwashing you, which I have a link to in my description below. They are literally attempting to get you hooked on a dopamine addiction. And it's not just me saying this. I have links in that video that I talk about to scientists who have, in fact, looked at this. They are intentionally getting you addicted to a dopamine rush. But beyond that, clearly these guys leak like a sieve. A bug that exposed everybody's private photos for several days, about 10 days for anybody, because any competent programmer, that's how their business model is, any competent programmer can write programs that access that information. If you're on Facebook, for God's sake, get out. Just delete your account and get out now. I've been out for over a year now. I haven't had a Facebook. And my life is all the better for it in many, many ways that I talked about. It is an addictive thing to get off of. But once you're over it, your outlook on life turns much, much more positive, because you don't have this constant droning in your ear of people who are just toxic. So you got a Facebook, get out now. Larry says, in Oklahoma City, you had horror host Count Gregor in TV. God, I wish I could remember this guy's name here in Lincoln and Omaha. He was out of Omaha. I don't remember his name. God. They had these everywhere. They had these everywhere, and they were often local hosts. They were often local. This was back when they actually did local television from time to time. As I say, I think they still do it in Chicago. When I was there, it was Sven Gulli, and I think they're on their second actor who played Sven Gulli. You can find him on YouTube if you look. But it's the same kind of deal. They would dress up, horror makeup and basically introduce and lampoon occasionally the movies that they were showing. And in Sven Gulli's case, he has just outright clips. So outright sketches he does sometimes. The other thing I have to talk about is the SJWs attacking crowdfunding. This one's quite a lot more serious. Last week, I mentioned that I completely deleted my Patreon account. I'd done this as a reaction to several recent bans that Patreon had made. The most recent, in my opinion, most egregious one was Sargon Avakad. He was not banned for violating Patreon's terms of service. He was banned because Patreon follows his brand and decided, after monitoring or being made aware of a racial slur that he made that he probably shouldn't have done. But if you know the context, it's not that horrifying. I wouldn't have done it, but under the context, you can see it makes a certain level of sense. And it was on somebody else's show. It wasn't even on his show. He was on somebody else's show. And some SJW types pointed to Patreon at it, and they banned him from Patreon over that. He is not the first one. He was the one for me, however, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. They have banned too many people for totally political reasons. That's the only reason they ban them. And they have admitted now that they will watch your content, even when it isn't on Patreon. They will watch it elsewhere. And if it doesn't conform to their beliefs, they will ban you. This is just stupid SJW stuff. And I cannot associate myself with that platform. And in any case, Patreon never really made me any money to speak of. And then I moved to Subscribestar, which was a Patreon alternative. Unfortunately, PayPal has now stopped Subscribestar from using them. This, at the moment, fundamentally changes how Subscribestar works, such that it is useless to me. Subscribestar now only makes payouts when you have reached $150. Now, I have to tell you, I've made a couple of $300 in donations total over the course of a couple of years. I'm a small creator. I know it. I know that I'm not getting a lot of money for it. I am extraordinarily grateful for those of you, Larry, who are contributing and supporting this show, but I don't get a lot of them. I am not Sargon of Akkad. I am not somebody who's making my living at this. Which, since they only will pay out $150, it could be months before I see any of that money. So Subscribestar, because of what PayPal has done, is now totally useless to me. My only way to get money now is two things. My PayPal tip jar, because they're still allowing that, at least for now, and my Amazon wish list. Now, my PayPal tip jar is listed in my description below. I do not dare put my Amazon wish list up because it could get me a community guidelines strike. However, if you want to support me, you can use that PayPal, or you can go to my website, www.wrstone.com. It's scrolling past here from time to time. And I have a contribute page right in the sidebar, and that'll show you how you can do that. It's more prominent on the promos, that website, which will show up towards the end of the episode here. And there is, again, a link in my description box. And you can see this also if you go to the site and you click contribute. You'll be able to see my Amazon wish list, which includes a couple of things I would like to have, one of which is in a laptop that I always talk about, that money always goes towards if I get the money. And I also wouldn't mind if you went out there and you bought me a Tillian Durables TH5 hemp hat, because I am going to have to replace this Indiana Jones hat at some point. And that hat would be nice to replace it with. Costs about $90, unfortunately. But it would also help me court Tilly hats as a possible sponsor. So, yeah. Now, why is this all happening? That's what a lot of people on YouTube right now are saying. There are a number of people who have pulled the plug on their Patreon accounts entirely. Geeks and Gamers, this evening, pulled the plug. They shut it down. Patreon had previously been a gigantic source of revenue for them, but they could not go along with this shenanigans either. So what I really want to talk about here is the previous part was just the self-serving part. How does this impact me? Well, you got my PayPal tip jar and my Amazon wish list. That's all. That's all you can do for me personally. But I want to talk about why this is happening. Now, on Patreon, the answer is quite obvious. From everything that the people have said, you can go and research some of this yourself. But when you look at what the people at Patreon are talking about, it's like most platforms. It is filled with socialists and communists who, by definition, don't approve of free speech, and so will therefore use any means, any excuse to silence anyone who disagrees with them, who disagrees with socialist and communist philosophies. And one of the ways you do this, obviously, is through income. Sargon of Akkad had been using this as a primary source of income on which he was actually living. Now, while I doubt that I will be ever able to live on Tales from SYL Ranch, I have to say, growing up to Sargon would certainly be one of my, goals if I ever could, or some other high-profile YouTuber who makes money off of it. That would be a dream of mine. But as a libertarian, I believe in free speech, and I cannot associate myself with individuals or companies that would attempt to silence people by killing their income. Now, I have to say, does Patreon have the right to kick people off for political reasons? Yes, they do. They have the right to refuse service to anyone for any reason, just as any other business have. However, I have the right to vote with my feet, which is what I did by deleting my account, and I suggest as loud as I can that anybody else that's got a Patreon, delete it. And others are doing the same. A couple of very high-profile YouTubers, one of whom was number 13 in terms of their top earners on Patreon, killed his account. Geeks and Gamers, which made a lot of money off of Patreon, killed its account. And there's at least one other person who did a live stream this evening who is also about to kill his account. And I would hope that these sounds, because we can only vote with our feet, the only way to deal with this is to not associate with it. And I would certainly hope that the sounds of the thundering feet going off the platform will eventually cause Patreon to go out of business. When you don't have any customers, you will die. And I certainly hope that's what happens here. Now, Subscribestar is a much thornier problem because they were the ones that were banned from using PayPal. They have not done what Patreon has done. Indeed, far from it. They seem perfectly content to let anyone use their service, regardless of what they believe. You know, what made Subscribestar, I was happy about Subscribestar last week, and then later this week, when PayPal pulled the plug on them, made it useless to me. So you have to ask yourself, why did PayPal pull the plug? Because I doubt, I mean, there's conspiracy theories out there, but I seriously doubt that PayPal did this because they have an anti-free speech bias. Their business model makes money from transactions. Banning platforms like Subscribestar is really very contrary to their own financial interests. And they have done some bans to other people from time to time based on ideology, but I don't think that's what was going on here. It's just contrary to the financial interests. And it appears to be for social justice warrior interests, but I think that's actually too simplistic. Subscribestar are based in Russia. I do not know, Larry. I'm not sure where they're based. I just knew that they were the only, at the time, last week, a viable competitor, and now they are not. I think PayPal banning them has to do simply with avoiding violence. You have to remember, what are social justice warriors really famous for, aside from being complete jerks and a-holes all the time? They will send their militant wing, the Antifa, to your doorstep, where the Antifa will employ rocks, knives, and numbing agents, which they did, by the way, in the 2015 Republican National Convention, which you don't know about because the press never said anything about it. But I know because I was listening to freaking scanners, the police scanners, and I knew that people were getting injected with numbing agents. That's what the Antifa do. They also show up with Molotov cocktails. They do physical assaults, sometimes sending people to the hospital. Most recently, a couple of Marines who had no freaking clue what was going on. They were asked by a bunch of Antifa, "Are you proud?" They thought they were referring to Proud Boys. These Marines didn't even know who Proud Boys were. And they said, "Are you proud?" And they said, "Well, we're Marines." You know, guys who are in the service usually are proud of that. And they said, "Are you Proud Boys?" And they said, "What the hell are you talking about?" And they got beat up by Antifa. These guys will send you to the hospital, and they will cause property destruction. They need tens of thousands of dollars, if not more. This kind of violence, mayhem, and destruction is the threat behind any social justice warrior activity. If you do not respond to their demands, there is every likelihood that your employees will be put at risk of death and your property at risk of complete destruction. That is now the obvious implied threat behind any social justice warrior activity. This is out and out extortion of a political kind. Do what we say or we will kill you. It's just as simple as that. So in the face of this, what does a responsible company do? Do you hire thousands of security guards for all of their properties and all of their employees? Or you just do the easy thing, which is kowtow to the demands? And I don't blame PayPal for doing this. In the face of threat of violence and death, they've done the same thing. Now, as a business response, if you are a businessman, the biggest problem is Silicon Valley. I was in IT for 40 years until health concerns forced me to retire. And I can say that I have now been of two minds about things. On the one hand, I am extremely proud to have been part of the generation and actively involved in creating today's internet. On the flip side, I now see that it can be seriously misused and it is being seriously misused by some of the smartest people who have been involved in making it, and they are all centered in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is filled with nothing but socialists and communists, and they support social justice warriors and their militant wing, the Antifa. If you are starting a business or that needs IT or is based on IT, or maybe you're thinking about relocating your business somewhere else, don't do it in Silicon Valley. Don't go there. Come here, for example. Come to the Midwest. Come to the Upper Great Plains. Come to Omaha, Nebraska. Now, I know, I've talked to some of you. I know you think we're hicks and rubes. But I'm telling you, man, Omaha is a metro area of 1 million people. And I have lived here my entire life after spending 10 years in Chicago. And I can tell you that the difference between the Omaha metro area and the Chicago metro area is that Chicago's a hell of a lot bigger and has a hell of a lot more crime per capita. And we are not generally SJWs. In my 40 years in IT, the overwhelming majority of my colleagues were either conservative, libertarian-leaning conservatives, or outright libertarians. We will not do the same things that they do in Silicon Valley. We do not have that culture. If you're a businessman, leave there. Uproot yourself and come here. Hell, go anywhere but Silicon Valley. Leave it behind to die an ignoble death as people leave it. By the way, just so you know, the cost of living here is a fraction of what it is in Silicon Valley. For $250,000, you can get yourself a damn mansion out here. So if you're a businessman with IT needs, leave Silicon Valley right now. They are the problem. Get out. Come to somewhere like Omaha, Nebraska, where you can prosper and do what you want and not have a giant culture of social justice warriors that will support people who will kill you. Now, as a libertarian, a response for individuals, I can really only offer one reasonable response. Simply remember that there are a lot of SJWs out there, and their ultimate threat is death. So take precautions for yourself. It is legal. If it is legal, carry a concealed weapon on your person, preferably a gun, because in an SJW Antifa attack, it will save your life and probably the lives of countless others. If you can't carry a gun, carry a good knife. Bowie knife comes to mind. A katana would be nice, but carry a knife and keep your gun as handy as you possibly can. And get proficient in both of them, or either, whichever you're going to carry. Because if you don't know how to use them, they aren't going to save your life. The U.S. Second Amendment exists for several reasons, and one of them is to protect yourself from vicious thugs like SJWs and their militant wing, the Antifa. You have to remember this. Get it through your head because it's really important. SJWs use the Antifa to do their dirty work, and the Antifa are deadly. There is no government that is going to do anything about this, ever. Government cannot protect you. Only you can protect yourself. Self-protection is a function that can never be delegated, not in the real world. You must always do it yourself. Self-protection is something that cannot be delegated. You must always protect yourself. Social justice warriors and Antifa are deadly. So take precautions and always hope that you never have to resort to them. Okay, that's my clip. Responding back to Larry scum and villainy in Hollywood and Silicon Valley too. Yeah, but in a different way. In a socialist, communist, we will crush your views if we don't like them sort of way. Yeah. All right, something marginally better to talk about. I do, of course, have coming up on the 31st my New Year's Day 5-hour live stream charity. Because as a result of learning that one of my regular viewers has a brother who was a resident of Paradise, California, which you can now see behind me. He's lost everything. By the way, if you happen to be watching at some point, Supercruise63, get a hold of me, wrs@wrstone.com. I'd like to talk to you specifically about some charities that will benefit your brother. But at the time, when I learned it, I asked him personally if there's anything I can do. And then I realized, oh, hell, I can do something. I have a platform. I can do something about it. So I'm going to be holding a live stream for 5 hours as a charity to raise money for campfire survivors. I'll also be doing non-spoiler reviews of The Orville and Doctor Who that day, and hopefully some other things that I'll get baked in there in the next couple of weeks. Time is going to be 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Mountain, 3 p.m. Pacific, and if you're working off UTC, that'll be 11 p.m. My intention there is to give you enough time to get over your hangovers from the night before and, maybe watch a little sports and then get over to my line. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I actually finally have created a video where I pulled out some of the stuff I've said in the last couple of weeks and made a video out of it. And there's a link below. I suggest you watch it. That's one of those things I really wish that video, if you wanted to share it around, please do. I think it would help a lot because the more eyes I have on that show, the more money I'm likely to get, and the easier we can make some people's lives. So, I guess at this point, I might do a little ad copy in the spirit of Ernie Anderson, one of those voiceover guys. On December 26th, Boxing Day, on Tales from SYL Ranch, attacks by tomatoes hold the nation and the world in a grip of fear. Now a special government task force is set up to investigate the violent fruit and put a stop to their murderous spree. That's December 26th, Boxing Day, on the Fandi Masters' 40th anniversary review of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. And, of course, my schedule is as it always will be, even though it's the 26th and we're not a Monday night. That'll be a Wednesday. I will still be here at North America at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Mountain, 6 p.m. Pacific, and if you're working off of UTC, that's 2 a.m. the next morning. In terms of other stuff that's coming up, well, again, after Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, I have my 5-hour live stream charity to raise money for campfire survivors. Again, those are the times. And I have a video below where I kind of made it into a trailer and a beg for please show up at my stream. Appreciate it if you would share that. And then after that, January 4th, I'm doing, starting Fridays, I will be doing the Orville every Friday. If I can get it to work on Thursdays, I will, but I think it's probably going to be Fridays. And on January 7th, I will then be doing the 70th anniversary review of The Son of Frankenstein. January 14th, The Mistress of the World. And then filling out, because I had holes in the remainder of the year, I thought this would be fun. January 21st, a retro review on the suggestion of Larry. A retro review of King Kong from 33 rather. And then, just because I had a long and glowing review about one film, on January 28th, I'm going to do a retro review of 1984's Supergirl. As they say, I sometimes do schlock. I have the entire month of February scheduled. If you want to see it, go to my website, www.wrstone.com. Click on the schedule. And a little hint, if you click on any given schedule item, you may be able to find a place where you can watch it on the internet for free. I usually try to find stuff like that. As always, as someone who has been in IT for 40 years, I must insist that wherever you go on the internet, you use aggressive ad blockers. And I recommend uBlock Origin. That's the letter U, B-L-O-C-K, Origin. You can get it in your browser's add-on repository. Now, if you want to support the show, well, at this point, you can like the video, you can subscribe to my channel, and tell all, of course, your friends, family, neighbors, pets, and livestock to do the same. And again, I will be holding this live stream. I know I moved myself over there for that one. I'll be holding this live stream, and this is one of the few times that I suggest that if you're going to support me financially, again, if you've been doing it like Larry has, thank you, Larry. If you've been doing it like that, put it over in PayPal tip jar because it's the only thing I got left. Or check out my Amazon wish list and see if there's anything there that you want to throw money at, because it'll all go help my production values. But in this instance, in this particular instance, I would ask you to hold off on your donations and wait for the 5-hour live stream charity. Because as we can see from this picture behind me, there are clearly people who need this money a hell of a lot more than I do. So, always must thank those who have contributed to me, Larry, among others. And I am already using some of that money, what I've got in here in terms of, I bought some stuff straight off of eBay for my photographic equipment. So thank you very much for that. And all the money will always accumulate toward buying a laptop that is on my Amazon wish list that will make all of my technical problems disappear. And if you go to the contribute page on my website, you will see listing out precisely what will make it disappear, like my low frame rate. Potentially the ability to up my resolution, although I think 720 is probably where that's going to stay. But the ability to move around, be more mobile. Just all kinds of things that it would make nicer. But I also have that Tilly hat on there, which is also be good. Someday, using this the way I am, it's going to start being something I can't use and I'll have to replace. So, beyond that, I guess that is all the time that we have today, boys and girls. So, tune in again next Boxing Day on December 26th for my review of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Until then, this is Tales from SYL Ranch, the vlogcast that reminds you to always know where your towel is. And I'm your host, Bill Stone.
Ultimate power in this world has always been one simple thing: the control and manipulation of minds.